some sort of organism from coming in and affecting a resident population. So in our context, we're talking about a group or a horse, more than one, on a property, and how to prevent any illnesses, infections, parasites, and as I said, we will touch on plants from coming in and affecting our nice little horse property. So parasites, bacteria, viruses, and plants are probably the main things that we're talking about, really. And as I said, I really would like to focus on practical things today. So what really affects us as horse owners on a day-to-day basis. There's no point me telling you, long-winded explanations of how viruses and bacteria work and things like that. We need to talk about what we can do practically to help ourselves. So biosecurity principles, I think, like I said, we'll do the boring definitions first, and we'll do the rest of it, the more exciting stuff, a little bit later. So number one, we want to prevent disease from happening. So there's sort of, I guess we can group our prevention measures into two main areas. So we have bioexclusion, meaning that we keep the disease out. So that means that we put a virtual barrier around our property and we completely prevent the disease from coming in, or we keep the disease in a very small area like an isolation or a quarantine area. So that is our number one way that we're going to try and implement biosecurity. So if we think back to the coronavirus example, bioexclusion means stopping the virus from getting in and spreading in the population, whereas point two, the prophylaxis is just a medical term for prevention. In coronavirus terms, we're a very long way away from that, as I'm sure you're aware, trying to find a vaccination. So we really do focus on bioexclusion rather than prophylaxis. Now, risk assessment. So we have a couple of things. One is the animals, animal factors. So that means what type of horse, we're obviously talking about horses, what type of horse, what that horse does, where that horse goes, any underlying health conditions that it might have, that sort of thing. And then we've got our property and location factors. So where we're located. I think one of our listeners is in New South Wales, but everyone else, I think, from what Julie was saying, sounds like they're in South Australia, which is interesting in itself. And then the type of property that we have. Is it the kind of property where people are coming and going a lot, or is it very isolated? These are all factors that we're going to think about. Then the last thing we want to think about for individual diseases is this term, point three, epidemiology. So epidemiology essentially is the science of the behavior of diseases. So we want to think about disease prevalence. So does the disease exist in the area that we're in, or is it exotic? Is it only overseas? And then we want to think about so these two words, morbidity and mortality. So morbidity means how many horses are affected and how severely they're affected. And mortality means how many horses die of the disease. So obviously we have a very large range of diseases that can affect our horses. Some are very uncommon, but almost always cause death. Some are very common, but are very, very unlikely to kill a horse. So we really need to think about those factors of morbidity and mortality when we think about our diseases. So with this slide here, no prizes for guessing the disease that I'm sort of hinting at in this slide. And I could probably work out how to point at things. So obviously this is a horse with strangles over here on the right, the abscess underneath the lymph nodes there that you can see draining. And so some of these pictures here represent some of these terms over here on the left. So one thing we need to think about is sort of animal factors. So we have our areas where lots of horses mingle together. And I always say to people, and this is half a joke, but if you'd like to get a horse with strangles or introduce a horse onto your property with strangles, the best thing to do is to go to one of the sale yards and you rescue one of these poor horses for $300. It's unfortunately a very good way of spreading strangles around. Probably most of the strangles cases that I've seen in practice have been linked to seeing of lots of different types of horses. It does predispose to that kind of thing. Oh, I apologise. I've got a little, my internet is unstable again, so I hope that isn't affecting everyone too much. So then we have our little fluffy pony down here in the middle. As you can see, he looks like he has Cushing's. Again, no prizes for guessing that. So you need to think about if you have a property full of cute little fluffy Cushing's ponies, as I'm sure you're all aware, they don't have a very good immune system. So they will be very predisposed to getting infections. Then we have here probably the most well-known prophylaxis or prevention measure that we have in Australia. We have obviously a vaccination for strangles and a vaccination for tetanus. And I'm sure that everyone that's listening tonight, their horses will be vaccinated, because you are, you know, caring and switched on horse owners, and you know that your horse needs to be vaccinated 100% for tetanus and probably for strangles as well. Now, through in this picture here, we are in, as I said, mostly in South Australia. So there's a few diseases that affect us more or less depending on our location. And thankfully, strangles is one that we see very rarely in South Australia, but it does exist. So we have to bear that in mind. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about zoonoses. And I'm going to keep talking about coronavirus, unfortunately, but I've written here, if you didn't know what a zoonosis was before 2020, you probably do now. So a zoonosis is a disease that passes from animals to humans. And that is, as vets, as horse owners, as, you know, the general public, that is our number one concern. You might not think it is, but it is. We have to, you know, put human health above all else. And it's very important that in this day and age, we apply a One Health perspective to our horses, and we make sure that there's no risk of passing infection from horse to human. And we're very lucky with horses. There's very few diseases that do pass from horses to humans, but there are, and some of them can be quite nasty. So I've put the options up here, the ones that are most relevant to South Australia that we might see. Now we've got ringworm, which is this middle picture here. You can see there a nice little ringworm lesion, and one of my colleagues that I used to work with got a nice one of these on the side of his face 2 weeks before he got married, and that wasn't much fun for him. So ringworm can be, although it's not going to kill you, can be nasty. We've got salmonella and clostridia as well, which are two bacteria that horses commonly carry in their bowels, that can be passed to humans. So we've always got to be thinking about zoonoses. And I guess there's another aspect of biosecurity. You know, we might get a disease on our property and our horses, but then we still need to have a biosecurity aspect to stop it from spreading to humans. So you've got your very basics like washing your hands and things like that before we do anything after handling horses. Now, so we're going to think about biosecurity, and we're going to break it into what things can threaten the biosecurity of a horse property. So the first one that's, I think, obvious is horses. So we all love horses, and what goes along with loving horses is taking them places. There are a few people that just have a few horses in their backyard and they don't take them anywhere. But I would say the vast majority of horse owners, and I count myself among horse owners, I've got my own horses too, the vast majority of us, we want to take them places. And if we don't take them places, we're always thinking about adding to our herd, maybe buying another horse, or we've spotted a nice rescue or something like that. Or we might be thinking about selling a horse. Or we might just like going for a nice trail ride. But I would say most of us probably do take our horses on and off the property. So that is probably the number one way that we can bring diseases on and off our property, is by moving horses around. And we'll talk a little bit later about how does that happen. How do we buy a seemingly healthy horse and it arrives and brings problems with it? Likewise, we sold a horse that was perfectly healthy, and when it arrives somewhere it's not, and we'll talk a little bit about the principles behind that. But moving horses around is probably our number one problem with biosecurity on horse properties. So the next thing that poses a threat to biosecurity on horse properties is people, and that's I mean that not in the indirect sense, as in, you know, we obviously make all the decisions behind moving horses around. I mean, people coming and going off the property. And again, horses, they're high maintenance animals. Myself, as a vet, I can tell you tomorrow that I've probably going to at least 8 different horse properties, and I'll be stopping in at our clinic, and my own house is a horse property too. So I'll probably be visiting at least 10 different horse properties tomorrow, and touching all of those horses, and often getting quite up close and personal with those horses, as you can imagine. So as a vet, we do pose a threat to the biosecurity of other people's horse properties. Now, I'd like to think as vets, we're very good at managing that and recognising the risk, but it's still a potential problem. Then you've got all the other professionals that go along with horse care. You've got your farriers, your chiros, your physios, and then we put these pictures up, the worming and the vaccinations, because a lot of people are perhaps not as vigilant or on top of these things. And again, as I said, I'm sure everyone who's taken the time to listen to a webinar on biosecurity on horses is quite diligent horse owners, but not everyone is. And we will find a lot of horses are not up to date with their vaccinations, not on a good worming treatment protocol, that kind of thing. So I put those up there as a reminder that just because you buy a horse from someone, don't just assume that it's had the same level of care as your horses. Always assume. I think the worst is probably the safest thing to do. So the next thing on our list of what poses a threat is fomites. So this term fomite, it basically means an inanimate object that can carry a disease. So your classics are, you know, all the gear that goes along with horses. Again, if you'd like to bring ringworm onto your property, go and buy some nice secondhand horse rugs or something like that, and don't wash them and chuck them straight onto your horse. And that's a great way of bringing a fungal pathogen onto the property. Likewise, you know, clothing, gear, riders, boots and chaps at the track, at the racetrack, when we have, you know, lots of track work riders riding multiple horses in a morning. Again, a nice way to spread ringworm. Things like twitches. You know, we as vets are quite careful that we do disinfect our twitches between horses, but a twitch is a great way to spread disease even around a yard. You know, one horse with a snotty nose that, you know, the vet comes out and scopes it and has this nice piece of, it's generally hay band, isn't it? A nice porous material right around the horse's nose, and the snot and what have you is coming out on here. And then you go and treat a few other horses, give them injections or something using the same twitch. Nice way to spread, you know, strangles bacteria or herpes virus or something like that. And the last one I've got on here is your transport. Oops, sorry about that. I'm going the wrong way. Sorry, I'll just go backwards a little bit. So yes, your transport. Again, you know, you take a horse to the vets with diarrhea and it poos all over your float, which happens, and then a couple of days later you don't disinfect and take another horse out. Nice way to spread infections around too. So any of these kind of inanimate objects that do come into contact with horses are a potential way of threatening your biosecurity. So last one I put on here is plants and other animals. So the number one way to bring weeds onto a horse property is via hay. I hate lecturing people about hay because I know how hard it is to get hay. Sometimes you just got to get what you can get. But ideally, we'd be growing it on our own property. And if that's not the case, sourcing it locally rather than getting it interstate, and, you know, preferably a reliable source would be important. So we don't want to be bringing any unusual plants or weeds, you know, something like gauze, for example. Absolute nightmare. Our old property in Victoria had a lot of gauze and it took us a long time to get it out. Really nasty weeds you can bring in with you. And South Australia does have quite specific quarantine laws around plants. I mean, mostly I did a little bit of reading, mostly relating to fruit fly, which doesn't really affect horses, but you know, there are some rules around that. And then other animals, you know, bear in mind cattle, sheep, There's not too many pathogens which do cross between the species, but your fungal infections like your ringworm, again, very, very common in cattle and sheep and can easily jump to horses if you have them on the same property. So bear in mind, it's not just horses moving on and off the property that you need to be aware of. So like I said, I'm going to try and keep it practical and interesting. And I'm biased because I'm a vet, so I like to talk about the more gory things. So I'm going to talk about some specific horse diseases that I'd like to focus on or think about, which could really affect you and your horses. So the first one we're going to talk about is parasites. This is hard because normally I would try and get a little bit more feedback from the audience, but I'll ask you to think about at home, who has had a problem with worms and parasites with their horses, be it colic, be it stomach ulcers, be it persistent elevated worm counts, poor condition, poor coat, itchy bum, whatever it was. It is very, very common. And worms are starting to frighten us now. There's reports even in Australia from places like the Hunter Valley of strongyles and ascarids, which are the two main types of worms, that are resistant to every single wormer that we have. That's a very, very big problem. If you look at the bottom of the slide here, you see this piece of bow from a young horse, just absolutely full of these roundworms. Obviously, this was fatal, as you can see. It's a very nasty disease. So the ones we're thinking about in terms of bringing onto a property are your bots. Good time of year for these little guys. So the bots, the strongyles, which are your redworms, the roundworms, your ascarids, and the tapeworms, which are probably the bottom of our list, really. But those are the parasites that we need to think about. And I think biosecurity-wise, worms are the ones that slip through the net, I reckon. People are pretty good with things like strangles and sick horses and things like that, but they don't think about parasites. They assume that the horse that they bought has been well wormed, bring it onto the property, and then all of a sudden we might have some resistant parasites on the property or a sick horse potentially as well. So I think parasites are one that slips through the net biosecurity wise. So sort of covered this. Worm resistance is becoming a really big problem in Australia. I think we've covered that already. Parasite burdens cause a lot of disease, and a lot of people don't use best practice. This is a whole other webinar in itself, but if you're sitting at home thinking, no problem, I use the rotational wormer, I worm with Strategy T or whatever, I follow the little worming chart that I got, you're not doing it right. I hate to break it to you. We've gone away from rotational worming. We've gone away from all of that kind of stuff. We're going for evidence-based fecal worm egg counts and worming appropriately as guided by those fecal worm egg counts. And I completely understand, because I know that worming has changed so much in the last 10, 20 years. It's changed a lot. So if you're sitting at home thinking, wait a sec, this doesn't sound right, have a chat to your local vet and figure out the way that you should be dealing with parasites in your animals. But that's sort of aside from biosecurity. But the point is that a lot of people aren't on top of their worming. Now, you'll know, again, completely separate webinar topic, I think, but eggs and larvae can live on pasture for a really long time. Depending on the worm that you're talking about, it can be 3 months plus. Your strongyles, which are the red worms, which you see in this picture here on the poo, they can exist in what we call an encysted state. So it's a dormant state inside the bowel for quite a long time as well. And they don't lay eggs, which is always a worry, and they can cause pretty severe disease. One thing I'd like to impress on people is you cannot tell if a horse has worms by looking at it. And that, I think people find that quite hard to get their head around. I went to Pony Club 2. I did my B test. I learned that you can tell a horse is wormy because it's got a pot belly and a poor coat and it doesn't put on weight and it gets colic and so on. I promise you, it's not a very good way of telling if a horse has worms. So you can't tell just because a horse looks shiny and healthy that they don't have any worms. So I've tried to add, sort of some practical management tips here at the bottom. So management tips for thinking about worming and parasites and biosecurity. So number one is think about fecal worm egg counts. When that new horse comes onto your property and it goes into isolation or quarantine, as we're going to talk about later, run a fecal worm egg count on it on arrival, so we know where it's at. Put them into quarantine. I'm not going to dwell on that because that's at the end of the presentation. And certainly things like collecting droppings from new horses. So you get your new horse and it's in quarantine, then make sure that you pick up those feces and dispose of them somewhere appropriate, whether it's burning them or laying them out, drying them, or whatever it is, rather than allowing that horse to pass its egg-ridden feces onto your pasture. So talk a little bit about strangles, which we've already touched on. Like I said, I personally found this the most interesting. Perhaps it's just me. Strangles is a disease I think everyone's frightened of. What to look for with strangles? The horse almost always has a high temperature, almost always has a snotty nose or a nasal discharge, swollen glands, which are your lymph nodes, most commonly underneath the chin, as you can see in this little picture of this foal. That's where the term strangles comes from. So those lymph nodes underneath the throat swell up and make it difficult for the horse to swallow, eat, and sometimes breathe as well. So you tend to get quite a reduced appetite too. So strangles is one that we're always frightened about. Now you will hear, I think, it's sort of the common thing to say that we don't see strangles in South Australia. I think that is pretty untrue. It's not a notifiable disease here as far as I'm aware, which it is in Victoria. I actually looked this up, so perhaps we don't report it as much, I'm not sure, but I do think it's an important one for South Australian horse owners to be on top of. Most horses with strangles get short-term disease, they get sick, but they mostly recover from it. It can, however, have fatal complications. We call that bastard strangles, and that's generally where the strangles bacteria spreads to the internal organs. That's pretty serious. Again, if you're sitting there thinking, no problem, my horse gets its vaccinations, it can't catch strangles. Unfortunately, the strangles vaccination is one of those vaccinations that is not 100% effective. Interestingly, it's a little bit like the coronavirus and why it's hard to make a vaccination for that, because strangles colonizes the upper respiratory tract. Like coronavirus, it's difficult to stimulate a good immune response to a pathogen that gets into the upper respiratory tract. But you should be vaccinating your horse every 6 months for strangles, which is pretty frequent. I'm not lecturing you because my horses don't get vaccinated every 6 months. So that's always, I understand why yours might not be. Now, it's a bacteria called Streptococcus equi, and it can live on surfaces for up to 3 days. So it can live for quite a long time. The other thing that you need to remember is you can get horses which are chronic carriers. So if you look at this picture over here on the right, if the infection gets into this structure here called the guttural pouch, these horses can become chronic carriers of strangles. Then they can easily spread the disease. So management tips: vaccination, that's your prophylaxis; quarantine, that's your exclusion; and certainly getting an extensive history on these horses, which is hard if you buy them from the sale yards. Now, I think I'm going a little bit slowly, so I better speed up. Now, ringworm. Again, that makes for some nice, interesting slides at least. One thing to impress on you, it is a fungus, not a worm. So please don't tell me my horse can't have ringworm, because I worm him all the time because it's a completely different disease. I understand it's confusing. Stupid name. Causes skin lesions, and it is zoonotic, okay? It is a pretty common disease. We see it most commonly in horses that have contact with sheep and cattle. And cattle and sheep can actually carry ringworm and not look like this. This picture is obviously a cow with bad ringworm, but they can carry it on their coats and not show any disease at all. Generally speaking, it's a bit of a nuisance only. So yes, your horse needs to be quarantined for a while. Yes, you will need to treat it, but it's mostly cosmetic or a nuisance. But the spores of the fungus can live for a really long time. I read a really interesting study on Sunday, which showed that the spores of the two most common funguses that cause ringworm in horses can live on surfaces for 4 or 5 days, which is a really long time. So management tips: your quarantine period is going to be important here, avoiding at least contact with other species and avoiding sharing gear between horses. Ringworm loves to live on, as I said, blankets, saddles, chaps, that kind of thing. So avoiding sharing grooming kits and stuff like that is a good one for ringworm. Herpes virus, this is one for all of you horse breeders out there. Time to prick up your ears. The equine herpes virus, so in horses, it causes the common cold. If we went and blood sampled all of your horses out there, I promise you about 90% of them will have had herpes virus at some point in their lives. Now, there are different types of herpes virus, okay? Equine herpes virus 4 is pretty common and it causes the common cold. Now, equine herpes virus 1 can also cause the common cold, in inverted commas, but it can also cause abortion storms. Oh, sorry about that. Abortion storms, so many pregnant mares to lose their fetuses at one time, and it can also cause a neurological disease causing the horse to be paralyzed, which is pretty nasty. Now, there is a vaccination for equine herpes virus. It is not really effective against the neurological form of the disease, unfortunately. It's generally recommended for pregnant mares to try and stop those abortion storms. And we recommend that at 5, 7, and 9 months of pregnancy. So if you've got a pregnant mare out there, now's a good time to start thinking about vaccinating her for that, especially if you live on a property where she has contact with horses coming and going from the property, or young horses, because they are much more likely to carry the herpes virus and get the common cold form of the infection. So management tips there, quarantining new horses, vaccinating your pregnant mares, and thinking about grouping your horses into groups. So I just said most of your horses will have been exposed to that virus. They're normally exposed as young horses. That's why it's very sensible to keep your young stock as a separate group, maybe with one old nanny, and your pregnant mares separate to that, and your competition horses that are coming and going again separate to that. So to try and avoid spreading the herpes virus between sort of vulnerable groups, really. So keeping the horses in groups on a property is good. Sorry, excuse me. So one that I've thrown in here is arboviruses, okay? These are a little bit of a buzzword in South Australia at the moment. They are mosquito-borne. So mosquito is the vector, okay? The common ones that we see are Murray Valley encephalitis, Kungin, and Ross River virus. And you probably heard, we have some, I learned this recently, some sentinel chicken flocks in the Riverlands in South Australia, and they have tested positive this year to these diseases, which tells us that they're about. And I can tell you clinically, in probably the last 3 weeks, I would say I've seen 4 or 5 horses that I believe have had one of these arboviruses. So they are about at the moment. What do they cause? What to look out for? High temperature, reluctance to move, swollen legs, sometimes neurological signs. Generally, it's a short-lived illness that they recover from quite quickly, but there are reports of, certainly in humans and potentially in horses, that they can show some signs of chronic fatigue long term, and you have to be careful about bringing them back into work. Now, where does this fit into a biosecurity lecture, you're thinking? So I've thrown this in there really because this is one where you're not going to bring an infected horse onto the property. I'm not going to bring it onto the property as a vet. It's going to come onto your property via mosquitoes. How do we control mosquitoes? Not my specialist subject, but the most important thing is to remove standing water. And I was told a while ago by one of the DPI vets in Victoria, one of the classic places, you've got a few old tyres lying around, you get that rim of water on the inside, great place for mosquitoes to breed. So trying to control mosquitoes on your property and trying to keep them off your horse. So your prophylaxis again, prevention, rugs, mosquito repellent, that kind of thing. What exotic disease threats do we have in Australia? Now, you probably didn't come here to hear about this, so this is going to be fairly quick. Equine influenza, it's a virus. Again, pet hate of mine when people say, oh, my horse had the flu. Oh, I had the flu last year. Your horse did not have equine influenza. If it did, that would be really, really bad, and we'd all be in very deep trouble. So equine influenza is exotic to Australia. That's what makes me happy about coronavirus. We have a great history of keeping these viruses out. Hopefully we can do it again. As you're probably aware, in 2007, we did have an outbreak of equine influenza EI. It was linked to a horse that came here from Japan and probably, well, I think we can almost categorically say spread to other animals in horses in Australia via fomites, via people, via things going from the quarantine centre that probably wasn't as well locked down as it should have been. And it was devastating to the equine industry, all of us, really. It was a terrible, terrible thing to happen, and financially was very difficult for a lot of people. The other thing that's topical, Julie and I were just talking about African horse sickness. There is currently an outbreak in Thailand. It has a very high mortality, this disease, and it's very distressing by all accounts. Thankfully, it would need to be imported, and at the moment, we're probably in a pretty good situation that's unlikely to happen, but very nasty disease. And there are lots of other infectious diseases that could hit our shores. A plant biosecurity. I think I said this before, the main source of new plant material onto a horse property is hay. So when we're buying in hay, obviously it commonly has dried weeds in it and seeds. You can also have obviously spread by the weather, horse feces, other animal feces, and farm equipment as well. If you have someone come on to do spraying or harvesting hay, that kind of thing, you can bring weeds with you. We're thinking about a couple of different things. We might get undesirable species. So here you've got your flatweed. Again, I would do a poll if I could talk to you, but I'm sure many of you know what disease this is linked to. It's Australian string halt. So that disease where horses have that really high stepping gait, that's caused by flatweed, things like gores, and you could also bring on toxic species of plants as well. So very important to think about that hay. Now, tips for that, obviously inspecting the hay, a trusted source is good, or growing it at home and potentially buying it within state if possible. So I promised you we would talk about isolation. So again, I'm going to try and talk about practical isolation facilities if possible. So what is a sensible quarantine or isolation period? This is a good question. 14 days for coronavirus, right? For horses, again, ideally 10 to 14 days. People think when I say that's crazy, but as we'll discuss, it's really necessary. Preferably, they'd have no other contact with horses. Now, horses, I know, are herd animals, and if they can't see other horses, they're not very happy. Sometimes I suggest a sacrificial companion. It should be a healthy horse, preferably not one of your competition horses that you could potentially put in with this horse or next to this horse, at least so they can touch noses to keep the new horse calm, at least would be good. Now, it's really important to observe these horses whilst they're in quarantine. I like to say you should be taking their temperature once a day, writing it down, making sure they're eating, drinking, pooing, not lame, no skin lesions, no snotty noses, no weepy eyes, and also thinking about your vaccination, your worming, and your fecal worm egg counts. I would say a fecal worm egg count on arrival, worming potentially based off that, depending on the time of year. Discuss that with your veterinary surgeon, as I said, a whole other webinar. And vaccination, again, depending on where that horse is at with its vaccinations, you need to be thinking about tetanus and strangles vaccinations too. Other things to think about, I think we talked about this already, groups of horses, horses that go on and off the property frequently, elderly horses, young horses, pregnant horses, preferably grouped together. Keeping visitors, so visiting horses and visiting humans, away from resident horses. I think it's very important to have appropriate facilities for horses that are sick or injured. I'm dealing at the moment a difficult one with a horse that needs to be locked up in a yard, and unfortunately there's no way for it to have a companion, and it's sort of getting up to several weeks of being locked up for an injury and getting quite upset. So having stables or a small area at least that you can effectively quarantine or keep an injured horse. Nice to have a flow of traffic, so an in and out gateway instead of people sort of turning around and driving places they shouldn't be, and certainly things that are easy to clean. If you ever come to our clinic up in Achunga, you'll see we've all got sort of the spray down rubber matting and matting in the stables that comes up for cleaning, all concrete, metal or rubber surfaces, nothing porous, that's very, very easy to clean, and that's very, very important. So this is very brief disease detection. It's not really biosecurity, but it is important when thinking about isolation. So I think the most important thing that you can do is know normal horse behavior and closely observe that. So if the horse isn't eating or drinking or pooing, that's a sign that something's going wrong. Now, basic clinical signs that I think every horse owner should be able to do, and that's again another topic, temperature, heart rate, respiratory rate, and gut sounds are good as well. So it is really handy to have those things. And I think a bare minimum for a horse in isolation or quarantine is a temperature once a day. Now, why is that? So if you look at this little picture bottom right, which might look familiar, again, we've all learned a lot about things like this. So this is where the horse gets infected. This is called the incubation period. So that's the period that the pathogen is inside the horse, but not making the horse sick. And then now we get the symptoms, okay? Now, this red arrow here is the infectious period. So that is when the horse can infect other horses. Now you'll see that the infectious period starts before the symptoms. This could be 2 hours, this could be 3 days. So for something like strangles, for example, it's probably 2 or 3 days. So they're infectious, but they don't look sick. This is why quarantine is so important, and this is why it needs to be 10 to 14 days long. And often horses at this point will actually have a little bit of a temperature, but you don't notice because the horse otherwise looks okay. And that's why daily temperature taking is very important. Vaccination, I'll probably skip through this fairly quickly because it's perhaps not quite biosecurity. Well, it is really, but vaccination, it's an adjunct to biosecurity, not a replacement. What should you be vaccinating your horses for? 100% tetanus, although it's not really relevant to this presentation because it's not contagious. Strangles, definitely if your horse leaves the property or is on a property where other horses leave. And then equine herpes virus, we talked about that before. There's a lot of reasons that prevention using biosecurity is preferable to relying on vaccination, not least because if there's a strangles outbreak, it's unfortunately recommended not to vaccinate horses in the face of an outbreak. So if you ring me and say, I'm on an adjustment property and 3 horses have gone down with strangles, I've just realized I forgot to vaccinate my horse, could you please come and do it? If there's a possibility that your horse has been exposed to strangles, we shouldn't really vaccinate it, because if they are in that asymptomatic period but they're infected, the vaccination can trigger a worse form of the disease. So again, really one of those times where prevention is better than cure. Record keeping, very important part of horse ownership. And if you own the property, I think you should be really diligent. I mean, the buck sort of stops with you in some ways. And in this day and age where we have so much work, health and safety and all that kind of thing, it's really important. Insurance, all that kind of stuff, it's important to be very diligent. So what should we record? Movements on and off the property, preferably horses and humans. I've noticed properties that I've been going to lately have had a little register of who's been going on and off the property because of coronavirus. But I actually think it's a really good idea to have that all the time. It's good to know what vets, farriers, whatever were on and off the property. So that is really important. Remember the requirement for that PIC number, the property identification code. That's very important. We must always have that. I think people with cows and sheep and things are much better than that than horse owners. But if we do get an outbreak of a disease, we're going to need that information for sure. Now, an example horse property. I found this quite hard to tackle this sort of example thing because, you know, everybody is different, aren't they? But I've come up with an example. Perhaps it'll trigger a little bit of discussion. So let's say it's an adjustment property. We've got 6 adjusters, you know, some are competitive, some are just happy hackers. We've got 4 dressage horses belonging to the owner, 2 pregnant mares, regular lessons both on and off the property. So the owner is going off the property and teaching at other places. And we've also got non-resident horses coming onto the property and having lessons too. The adjusters are kept separately in 2 horse paddocks, no contact with the owner's horses, but there is a shared arena, wash bay, tie up, you know, stables, all that kind of stuff, and just the 1 parking area for everyone. So we have to think about a little risk assessment. We've got horses leaving the property and coming back on. That's a concern, and we don't know, you know, if you're into eventing like me, we go away for the weekend, horses stay in yards next to someone else's yard, you know, they touch other people's horses and all that kind of thing. There's a lot of horse-to-horse contact at competitions, generally speaking. Horses are coming on for lessons. We don't necessarily know their health status. Big problem with adjustment properties is a huge mix of management strategies. Some people worm, some don't, some vaccinate, some don't. It's very sort of all over the place, I generally find. So it's nice to have a blanket approach. Lots of people coming onto the property. Obviously, when you've got adjusters and that number of horses, you're going to get lots of professionals coming off. Feed and hay from various sources. And we've got these shared facilities, you know, shared arenas, shared tie-ups, shared wash bays, that kind of thing, which are easily contaminated with bacteria and viruses and often not cleaned 100%. So what could we do on a property like this? So it'd be great to separate the horses. If we've got some, happy hackers or retired horses or the pregnant mares, perhaps they should ideally not have any contact with the horses that do come on and off the property, and no contact between horses arriving on the property for lessons and the resident horses. Good to have a blanket approach, as I said, to preventative measures like vaccinations, and also perhaps a blanket approach to hay and things like that too. Great to have a separate wash and tie-up area for horses that are visiting short term. That just kind of takes the equation of multiple horses coming from short times, but they almost always want to wash them and things like that. Try and minimize that risk of them sharing facilities. We want to introduce the isolation or quarantine area rather than just shared stables for everyone. And ideally, we would have one stable per horse if stables were required rather than shared facilities. Workplace health and safety, touched on it a little bit, very important, another webinar in itself. We won't go into it too much. But remember that at the beginning I said, One Health, human health is very important. So our biosecurity, we're all thinking about our horses. They're the ones that we're here for, but we've got to think about human health as well. So it's very important. Things like, and I think I was watching the news before this and I said, we've had a sixth of the number of flu cases that we normally have. Obviously social distancing, but also people washing their hands. It's great resources out there. You've got the World Health Organization, and my 3-year-old actually taught me how to wash my hands properly the other day. They're teaching them at childcare, so there you go. Hand washing and things like that, just basic work health and safety things are important. I popped this in here. We don't have time to talk about Hendra. We're not going to talk about Hendra because it's not very relevant to us here. But, personal protective equipment is important. Even just things like gloves. If you've got one horse that's sick with a snotty nose, you want to be looking after that horse last, and preferably at least wearing gloves, or at least thoroughly washing your hands. And maybe some of my clients have just got a little set of overalls that they just pop on when they're dealing with a sick horse. I certainly do. If I go to a horse property and the horse is sick, I'll pop my overalls on to keep my clothes clean, so that when I go to another property, I'm less concerned. So very important, personal protective equipment, and record keeping, as we said, very important. Okay, so that is the end of our biosecurity webinar. I didn't go